I want to welcome you to an evening entitled Remembering Edward Said. I'm Rashid Khalidi. I am the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. I have the honor to be the first person to hold that title. And I'm actually here in two senses because of Edward Said. I'm here in the immediate sense because when I had the honor of being offered this chair, which is one of those few occasions in my life where I was able to say to myself, this is one of those offers you can't refuse. When I had the honor of being offered the Edward Said chair, I took the advice of someone who was the most expert person I knew in negotiations with universities, which is to say Edward Said. And he had told me that the only time that you ever are taken seriously by university administrators is when they've made you an offer. And after that, you're just chopped liver. And so having received this wonderful offer and being extremely happy where I then was at the University of Chicago, I was engaged in a negotiation with the Columbia University administration about the terms and the details and so forth. And the reason that I'm here because of Edward Said is very simply because Edward was on the phone all the time, mainly to my wife, but also to me, saying, why hasn't he accepted? They made him the offer. Not good enough for him, the Edward Said, and so on. I won't even begin to imitate for you. I couldn't do it. His son could do a much better job than I can. So in that sense, I am here because obviously it was an offer I couldn't refuse. It was an enormous honor for me to be the first person to have that title and be in that chair. But that's a facetious sense in which I'm here because of Edward. The other much more, I think, serious sense in which I'm here because of Edward Said is because unlike the four, or at least three of the four distinguished speakers that we're going to hear tonight, who are or were students of Edward Said's, and the fourth who was the provost while Edward, I'll introduce each of them at the proper moment. Unlike all four of them, whose connection with him was essentially academic, I'm here because of things that Edward Said did, not so much in the academy, or not just in the academy, but outside the academy, to make the word Palestine, the name Palestine, the term Palestine acceptable, to bring it within the pale, to make it a term that was not one of opprobrium, that was not one of hatred, that was not one that you couldn't pronounce in polite company, but was a term of respectable debate, a term of discussion, a term of scholarly discourse. And this is something that perhaps we're not going to recognize fully in some of what we're doing here tonight, though I hope that the film that you're going to be seeing sections of, I know that the film that you're going to be seeing tonight in sections devotes a great deal of attention to this. But I invite you to consider the fact that the contribution that this man made was in many, many ways unique. There were a few others. Brahim Abu Lughad, whose daughter is a distinguished member of our faculty, was one of the others. There were several, in fact, who played a role in doing what I think Edward did more than anybody else, which was to wage a debate in the arena of American public discourse with people who denied the very existence of the Palestinians, the very legitimacy of the use of the term Palestine, and argued that this was something that had to be listened to, that these were people who had to have, as he put it, permission to narrate. We still don't have it, in the sense that if you read the New York Times, what passes for the newspaper of record, you will see the Palestinian paragraph as paragraph 27 or 18 in a story that goes on for 2 pages. Nevertheless, what he has done can be seen in the academy. What he has done can be seen at Columbia. We're commemorating 10 years since his passing, but this also is the 3rd year since the establishment of a Center for Palestine Studies. This is a man who had to fight for the very word Palestine to be uttered on ABC or in the columns of the New York Times. And at this university, the first one in the North or the South American continents, we have a Center for Palestine Studies. We, in other words, have benefited from his efforts and the efforts of other people, many of them like him no longer with us, who fought such that this would be possible over many, many, many years. So in that sense, I'm here because of Edward Said. And I'm extraordinarily pleased that so many of you are here. I'm particularly pleased that many of you are students, or at least you look like you're students. I can't tell. Some of you clearly are not students, but that's good too. And therefore, you're people who came to maturity, most of you, many of you in this room, long after Edward Said had left us, long after he'd stopped writing. But clearly, there was something there to draw you, and I'm extraordinarily pleased at that. I am not supposed to rabbit on forever. They told me to do a quick introduction. I've already, I think, overstayed my welcome on this podium. I want to begin our formal proceedings by welcoming Mariam Said, who is with us tonight in the audience. I want to mention all of our sponsors. The main sponsor of this event is, as I mentioned, the Center for Palestine Studies. But we could not have done this without other sponsors. The Department of English and Comparative Literature, of which Edward was a member from the moment he joined the faculty here until the moment of his passing, is also a sponsor. The Heyman Center for the Humanities is also a sponsor, as is the Middle East Institute, and we're very grateful to all of them. What we're going to do tonight is the following. Our program consists of reflections by 4 speakers, whose participation we appreciate greatly. The first is Jonathan Cole. I'll introduce him just before he speaks. The second, who will be appearing by film, is Gauri Visvanathan. The third is Mustafa Bayoumi. And the fourth is Timothy Brennan. As I've said, I'll introduce each of them separately later on. Between these 4 reflections by 4 people who knew Edward extremely well, we will be screening 4 excerpts from the film entitled Edward Said, The Last Interview. This was produced by Don D. Guttenplan. You're here, Don. Maybe you might stand up or raise your hand. Don is a student of Columbia. He went on to a distinguished career as a journalist and a filmmaker, writing for The Nation, The Guardian, International Herald Tribune. He's also written a book on Holocaust denial and a biography of actually one of my favorite writers, I.F. Stone. So we're going to start tonight with, so we'll have a film segment, and then we'll have a contribution by different speakers. We're going to start tonight with one of 4 segments from Don's film, The Last Interview. This segment, which we're about to screen, is on the writer and his audience.
Well, you have written that most students will come with a desire to conform, and as Paul Goodman has also written, leave the university with an even stronger desire to conform and advance themselves.
Yes, because
why do you teach? What's the point?
Well, one teaches really for the people who might be changed by it, and some have been. I mean, in some corner of their mind, there's a possibility that, you know, in teaching literature, I've never taught politics. I've never taught the Middle East, for example, about which I've written a great deal. But what I've tried to teach all along in acquainting students with the classics of literature, I never teach popular culture. I don't teach, you know, sort of junk fiction. I try to teach, you know, high-class art, basically, and music. The idea is to, put them in contact with it. You know, it happened to me with my own son, who had resisted during high school the notion that one could read literature. And then in his freshman year in college, I mean, it wasn't me, it was another teacher, who introduced him to Balzac. And I remember a phone call from my 18-year-old son in November of his freshman year saying, "How come, Dad, you never talked to me about this guy Balzac? He really is terrific, you know, that there is another world outside popular culture."
This is Wadia when you say.
Wadia, you know. So there's that. Second of all, to ask questions. You know, I spend a lot of time, as I grow older, making it obvious to the students that I don't know all the answers. In fact, I'm puzzled by passages in Hopkins or T.S. Eliot or Wallace Stevens, or, you know, so the thing of asking questions and not exactly raising the level of suspicion, but certainly troubling the mind rather than allowing it to be settled with questions and so on. And I spend a lot of time attacking doctrines and orthodoxies and dogmas. What good that does, I don't really know, but I mean, I think that it marks some students. So it's not really, you know, a major effect. But
it's not entirely futile.
No, I don't think it's futile, and I enjoy it. I mean, you know, for me, it's terribly important, and the writing is also very important for me because because of the internet now reach a large audience in the Arab world, which is what interests me the most. I'm interested in influencing opinion there. And trying to explain Arabs to Americans and Americans to Arabs is worth doing if you can manage it. And I've been very lucky that way, that they've given me a platform to do it in. As to the question of what one does and as to results, I like the idea of having more than one audience. I mean, the internet and the fact that now I write regularly for an Arabic paper, which I've been doing for the last 12 or 13 years. You know, the discipline of appearing, which is, terribly important, and you have the chance to do that. But in the final analysis, I realize that I'm not that anxious to satisfy my audience. In fact, or whoever reads me, and the same with the students, I think I'm much more interested in provoking and even stimulating resistance to what I'm saying than I am to giving them stuff that will amuse them or to keep them sort of interested. And I prefer that kind of, I guess it's a form of intransigence to the other kind, which is to work in cliches and in the known avenues. And the fact that I'm a literary person writing about, hard politics a lot of the time, and that my stance is, quite clearly oppositional. I've learned from, people like Chomsky and Alex Coburn, really to name the names and cite the figures. So that in the end, it isn't the audience that matters so much as the material. It's the subject that matters much more. And in the case of the subjects that interest me, they're also difficult subjects. I'm very attracted to the difficult as opposed to the comfortable and I'm much less interested in affirming than I am in negating or in some way being negative. So that the topics that historically I've always been associated with have been modernist literature, which is defined as difficult, the question of Palestine, which is not only difficult, it's almost impossible. But in that case there's also a human dimension, which is, my own experience, and which I don't really talk that much about, but it's there. And my relationship to people and my responsibility to people in very difficult, if not impossible, situations. The role of the intellectual, who is, by my definition, can't be organically connected to what she is writing about, but really is writing in sense of opposition. Music, which attracts me not because it's soothing. I can't listen to music and do anything else at all. It's especially when I'm ill. Music is, for me, a very difficult, almost impossible discipline, having to do with the most difficult rather than the easiest kind of music. I have mixed feelings about people like Mozart and Haydn, whom I love, but I'd much rather listen to, say, late Bach, the Art of Fugue and the Goldberg Variations and the Musical Offering, than I am interested in listening to sort of dance music or... So all of these subjects where the requirements of the subject are a constant challenge to one, whether morally, technically, intellectually, ethically, in all these ways. So in the end, your sense of the audience, which is what you're taught as a journalist and as a writer, for consumption, to cater to, it's just the opposite for me.
For those of you who never had the privilege and the pleasure of knowing him, that's a small taste. We'll have 3 more excerpts. Our first speaker is Jonathan Cole. Jonathan was the provost at the time that Edward was teaching here. And I'm not sure what he's going to talk about, but he could tell you stories about those days. Jonathan Cole is Provost Emeritus and Dean of the Faculties Emeritus of Columbia University. He served in these two capacities as the university's highest academic officer from 1989 to 2003, which is quite a span. Currently, he's the John Mitchell Mason Professor of the university, which means he's a university professor, and he's a member of the Department of Sociology. His fields of scholarly interest include the sociology of knowledge and science, and among his many writings is one of his most recent, I think it is his most recent book, The Great American University, Its Rise to Preeminence, Its Indispensable National Role, and Why It Must Be Protected, published by Public Affairs Press in 2010. And if there's anybody who can speak authoritatively on those subjects, it's Jonathan Cole. But I leave it to him to say what he has to say. Jonathan, please.
Thank you very much, Rashid, and it's a great, great pleasure to be here. Among other things, I had never I hadn't recalled really how beautiful Edward's hands were. Is that better? Okay. Well, we're here tonight to acknowledge, if not to accept fully, the fact that Edward Said died 10 years ago. But surely more than that, we're here to celebrate his continuing influence on our lives, on the institution of higher learning where he spent most of his days, and to comment on those ideas of his that continue to influence and inspire us, as well as new generations of scholars and people with moral and political courage and conscience. I have lost too many good friends by now, and I grieve their loss in a selfish way. I miss their voices, their laughs, and the remarkable exchanges that we had when debating ideas, conversations from which I invariably learned a great deal. I also miss the intense but sometimes lighter moments on a squash or tennis court, or playing one-on-one basketball, or reading their latest book or article. But in truth, I have to acknowledge that for me at least, the image of most of those lost friends and relatives recede into a timeless fog, and I sometimes regret that I rarely think of them anymore. This is not true with my dear friend Edward. Little time elapses between my thoughts of Edward, first as a truly unusual, loyal, and generous friend, but also as a rare person who was able to transform the world's thinking about literature. He changed the point of view of those of so many who cared about books and scholarly works. And as he said many times, point of view is everything. He lives on in a palpable way, and I frequently think of our breakfast conversations while Mariam was getting the kids out the door to school and hurrying off to work at the bank, leaving Edward to prepare a Middle Eastern breakfast for us as our entree into good talk. Friendship with Edward was, in fact, an extended conversation, a conversation over many years in many places. As we talked about the role of the intellectual, the idea of the university, the intersection of politics and teaching, and about music and sports, I came to realize that Edward had become my teacher as well as my friend and colleague. It was in large part through our conversations, and later through responding to the hundreds, even thousands of letters and emails that I received about him when I was provost at Columbia, that my own thinking about the nature of the university came into sharper focus. To this day, when I think about the enabling value of academic freedom, I can't help but think of those conversations with Edward. He was the most courageous academic I have known, and he still is. He lived under continual threat and yet he would not yield to the multiple forces that would have silenced his voice in the academy and beyond. Those of us who knew and loved Edward understood that he did not merely slough off these attacks. They hurt him, and yet he persevered in advancing positions that he knew would elicit vitriol from people who refused even to think about the content of his ideas. He did not insist that he was right, but he insisted on the right to have the conversation. This was as true as much for his literary ideas as for his political beliefs. He helped me realize that he needed the university and that the universities, at their best, were made for people like Edward. Only within this fragile and unique institution could they feel free enough and reasonably comfortable enough to develop and air new ideas that might offend those who refuse to confront new ways of thinking, as well as their own biases and presuppositions. Edward had a profound understanding of the missions of the university. As a teacher, he wanted students to read everything, not choose between works of one culture or another. Perhaps because Edward was the marginal man, the insider and the outsider, who belonged to multiple cultures but felt somewhat a stranger in each, he could, through his teaching and writing, offer us a wider horizon, a keener intelligence, and new angles of vision on literature and societies. In offering his vision, Edward often encountered disbelief and resistance, as when he tried over many years to get his publisher to translate and put into print the novels of Mahfouz. He was assured that there was no market in the United States for Egyptian novelists until 1988, when Mahfouz won the Nobel Prize. Edward taught us, but he would insist that he learned as much from his students as they could possibly learn from him, and he said the same about co-teaching courses with his colleagues. As a teacher, Edward always understood the distinction between the classroom as a place for free discussion and debate, even passionate debate, and as a place for proselytizing. To my knowledge, he never crossed that line. Together we came to understand and believe that, as the Calvin Committee at the University of Chicago stated in its now often quoted 1967 statement about the role the universities play in our society, quote, "If universities are to be faithful to their mission to discover, improve, and disseminate knowledge, that they will provide enduring challenges to social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by outcome, universities should create discontent with existing social arrangements and practices, and should propose new ones. In short, a good university, a university that is good for society in which it is embedded, will be upsetting. It will cherish free inquiry and will defend at all costs diversity of opinion and points of view." Edward articulated this idea of the university in his words on the role of the intellectual, quote, "Least of all should an intellectual be there to make his, her audiences feel good. The whole point is to be embarrassing, contrary, even unpleasant." Of course, in person, Edward was gracious and graceful and generous. He may well have been, as one of my children observed, the most charming man who ever lived. In an earlier reflective essay on academic freedom, Edward speaks again to the critical role of free inquiry. Quote, "Our model for academic freedom should be the migrant or traveler. For if, in the real world outside the academy, we must needs by ourselves, and only ourselves, inside the academy, we should be able to discover and travel among ourselves, other identities, other varieties of human adventure, but most essentially, in this joint discovery of self and other, it is the role of the academy to transform what might be conflict or contest or assertion into reconciliation, mutuality, recognition, and creative interaction, unquote. Recently, I've been reading a great deal about another towering figure of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. Both Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, and Anthony Sampson's exceptional biography, which Edward recommended to me in 1999, have not only enhanced my admiration for Mandela, who may not be with us much longer, but also brought home certain parallels between Mandela and Edward. These were men of unwavering courage and principle, yet also people of exceptional ability to have compassion and express forgiveness to those who were their antagonists. When Mandela spent all those years in prison in Robben Island, he set up what became known, in his words, a university, one where debate was open and free on all subjects, where he would teach those who were illiterate to read, and he would even allow his jailers to partake of the free university. As Najla Saeed remarks in her new humorous and poignant book, Looking for Palestine, about her own identity while growing up in the Saeed family, her parents, both of them, insisted that all people were to be treated alike, regardless of their ethnic, racial, or religious origins. Indeed, Mandela's lifelong unwavering commitment to one multiracial South Africa reminded me of Edward's belief in a one-state solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And when you add Mandela's early training and competence in boxing, with his strong interest in being impeccably dressed by fine tailors, how can the parallel between Mandela and Edward be possibly lost? At the end of his last summer, coming home from a trip one evening, I turned the corner at 113th Street and Riverside Drive, saw a car pull up to the stop sign, and heard a familiar voice, quotes, "Jonathan, where have you been?" It was Edward, in the right front seat with the window rolled down. Wadia was driving, and they had just returned from Edward's doctor on Long Island. Edward said, quote, "Don't you want to have breakfast? You must call me for breakfast." I said, "I've been away, but I'll call." As the car began to pull away, Edward leaned out of his window and said, "Don't forget me, John. Please don't forget me. My dear and wonderful friend of 30 years, I have not forgotten you. But as I said 10 years ago, I would have been a joy to grow old together." Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. That was very touching. The next selection from the last interview is on questions of identity, filiation, and affiliation. So,
has it been very hard for you in your life? Okay, your family were Protestants, sort of detribalized in Levantine terms, no longer belonging to one of the conventional.
Yeah,
methods.
Orthodox, Greek Orthodox.
So they left that, so they're already cut off.
Yeah.
Then you're cut off from Palestine in 48, cut off from Cairo and your entire family in 51, in this strange new world. Where did you go for sustenance, for a company, for support? Which I know in the Middle East particularly, people don't think of themselves as individuals. They think of themselves as parts of something.
Yeah, I didn't have much of that. I didn't think I was part of a larger whole. So a lot of the time I was developing a kind of independence of my own, as I said, outside my main identity, which was, as I grew older, I became a professor and a scholar, and so on and so forth. But I always had this other life, which allowed me to make connections with people. I mean, as I saw, it was useful or pleasurable for me. It's a kind of great luxury. Many years ago, I devised this scheme. It's a a verbal one, where the difference between filiation and affiliation, where filiation is, what you get from your inheritance and your background and, being a son, which is what I was. Affiliation are connections you make when the others sort of fail or break down. And since that filiation for me had always been a problem, I really spent a lot more time affiliating, making connections with people through my work, through politics, always across lines, with people who were quite different from me, and intellectually, people who were at the opposite extreme. I mean, that's the greatest pleasure of all, people whom in everyday life, for example, I would have nothing to do with because it'd be so reactionary. But to get from them or to somehow connect with them in ways that were sort of against the grain, that's been the greatest thing.
And who would you think of in this regard?
Well, I mean, the close friends I've had, who have been so different from me. Well, like Iqbal Ahmed, who's an Indian from Bihar who became a Pakistani, came from a very devout Muslim background, who was a kind of wandering revolutionary. And here was I, deeply embedded in the institutional life of the university. He never was. And, we had these strange connections with each other through Palestine, through the Third World, where we both became known. He was a great orator. And he was so itinerant. Wherever he went, he would do interviews. He had connections with people. In my case, it was always my writing that preceded and gave me a kind of reputation. But we had this very close bond that was deeply unlikely if you look at me in terms of my background and where I came from. I mean, Iqbal then became a friend of my mother. I mean, he would come to our house. But it was a very unlikely thing that would never have occurred in my childhood. Then intellectually, one of the great influences on me was an Italian philosopher that I read when I was about 20 called Vico, who was an 18th century Neapolitan, who was a professor of Latin eloquence. I think the single most powerful intellectual influence on my life has been Vico, Giambattista Vico. And there's nothing that we have in common. I mean, he was a devout, sort of Christian Latin scholar, very choleric, seemed like a very unpleasant man. A lot of the people I've admired in terms of writing are deeply unpleasant. Conrad, who is the great figure of my sort of imaginative life, was a Pole who learnt French first after he left Poland as a 17 or 18-year-old, and then worked in the French merchant navy, and then became an English sailor, and got his master's certificate as a captain when he was close to 30, and then became an English novelist. Also deeply unpleasant man from all accounts that we have of him, but his work has haunted me. So those kinds of connections are the ones that really interest me, not the ones with people who are like me, who come from similar backgrounds. But as I grow older, I realize that there aren't any people who are like me in a way. That there's a kind of, as the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins said, there's a wonderful line which has meant a lot to me. All things counter, original, spare. And I've tried to maintain that view of things, that where everything is original, and I've sought it out rather than trying to find likes. It's the unlikes and the asymmetrical and the unreconciled, which is also the core of the counterpoint, I think, the idea of the counterpoint.
Our second speaker is present absent. It's Gauri Visvanathan, who is a former student of Edward, as are the next two speakers after her. Gauri is the class of 1933 professor of the humanities at Columbia. She's a member of the Department of English and Comparative Literature. She's known for her work in 19th century British and colonial cultural studies with a focus on India. In addition to her books Masks of Conquest and Outside the Fold, she's the editor of Power, Politics, and Culture, Interviews with Edward W. Said, which was published by Vintage in 2001. Gauri is not in New York and cannot be with us, and so she has asked Mariam Said to read her reflection. So I give you Mariam Said reading for Gauri Visvanathan. Please, ma'am.
I want first of all to say how sorry I am that I cannot be present today to commemorate Edward's life and work. I am especially grateful to Mariam Saeed for graciously offering to read my tribute for the occasion. The title of my remembrance is Legacies, Intention, and Method. And it is obvious evocation of Edward Said's Beginnings, Intention, and Method, published in 1975. As a work that opened American literary criticism to French theory, even as it maintained a healthy distance from what Said considered some of the excesses of New Wave theory, Beginnings remains a landmark text among a certain generation of literary scholars who will insist, as I do, that Orientalism could not have been written without its predecessor. Granted, many commentators writing on the later book marveled at the distance Said had traveled from Beginnings to Orientalism. It was as if he had reinvented himself, forging a new beginning for himself that involved repudiation of the apolitical thrust of his earlier work. Michael Wood has observed that in some parts of Beginnings, Said was following a fashion that didn't suit him. The talk about text and textuality seems a little fussy, as if Said thought he had to acknowledge an almost infinite indirectness before he could turn to the direct connections that interested him. The scholar who at one point took pride in introducing French theory into the classroom later excoriated its tendency to shut the world out in the name of textual undecidability. Yet, the continuities between Beginnings and Orientalism are as startling as the obvious differences. For Said remained absorbed by the intersection between the linguistic production of meaning and the authorization of knowledge systems by power. If we are going to talk about legacies, then we must note that Said considered Orientalism to be among European philology's most enduring legacies, continuous with the production of linguistic taxonomies and hierarchies associated with the great project of European comparatism. He was fascinated by the generative power of Orientalism, by its protean ability to seep into the visual and literary vocabulary of Western art and shape the very quality that made it art. It is for this reason that he was less interested in fields of study that critiqued Orientalism as a symptom of Western pathology, which, by the way, was one of the directions of post-colonial studies from which he pointedly distanced himself, than in those that analyzed the inventory of traces, a favorite phrase of his drawn from Gramsci, left by Orientalism on works of the imagination. No small part of Said's delight in the works he studied and taught is that they provoked keen attentiveness to the imagery, vocabulary, and structure of their Orientalist representations, which he insistently showed as being at the aesthetic core of literary texts. Far from rejecting these works as tainted products of modern Orientalism, Said was clearly fascinated by them, sometimes alienating his followers who found that his humanist delight in the pleasures of the text had the effect of eclipsing ideological critique and resisting the expulsion of Orientalist text to the dustbin of history. If Orientalism became a rallying text around which those frustrated by persistent distortions of their culture and religions have mobilized, Said often found himself challenged to accommodate interpretations that stretched the limits of his own purposes and intents. for he retained an unflinching conviction that the aesthetic value of literary works is not compromised, but rather defined by the political interests that compose their writing in the first place. Thus, to read literature outside its political context and origins in the name of aesthetic appreciation produces only false or incomplete readings. Such approaches, he insisted, turn a blind eye on the vital conjunction between aesthetics and power, and Orientalism became for him the enabler of reading practices that kept such conjunctions in sharp focus. In later years, when the shock of his leukemia diagnosis prompted him to reflect on endings rather than beginnings, his somber reflections on mortality were in fact probing explorations of the nature of creativity and human history, returning Edward to themes he had begun to explore in Beginnings and in the essays comprising The World, the Text, and the Critic, published in 1983. In all these works, there is a continuing thread linking the realm of nature with that of human thought, but nowhere are the ties between the mortal human body and aesthetic theory explored with greater speculative energy and critical acumen than in the posthumously published On Late Style. Said's illness stirred the contrarian in him, and in Late Style he saw no serenity and accommodation, but rather contrariness and tension. The combative energy animating the Late Style of writers and musicians interested Said because he saw not only a new idiom in such works, but also resistance and refusal, qualities he persistently identified with the critic's responsibility to the present and ultimately with life itself. Said's aesthetic pleasure intensified his resistance to systematized thinking because of its narrowing of perspective, producing rigidities in place of a creative openness to discovery and knowledge. He remained in profound conflict with schematizations of all kinds. At times, the conflict was so intense as to make palpable his impatience with patterned, predictable reasoning. Surprise me was a phrase he often used in the classroom, and even now, as I recall his words, I continue to hear them as much more than a pedagogical injunction. The phrase evoked not only the dangers and risks, but also the urgency of uncharted exploration. In an interview about Beginnings published in Diacritics, Said drew an opposition between systematized thinking and hedonism, his term, defining the latter as the refusal to ply the well-trodden path. It is his use of the word hedonism that particularly interests me, a hint perhaps of why literary texts embedded in the perversions of Orientalist logics so fascinated him, as if there was an element of alienation in the very thing that attracted him. At times, the literary became synonymous with a complex mix of unpredictability, self-indulgence, and unregulated, even unrestrained cognition. Even as literary canons perpetuate cultural tradition and heritage, literature's resistance, routinization, paradoxically breaks it away from the sense of a past or a tradition, or what Said described as the freeing oneself of one's past attachments and habits and alliances. In the residual hedonism of critical acts, he found an empowering form of knowledge. Said's fierce resistance to method and system resulted in a reading method that was not systematized enough to form a blueprint for future readers. Ironically, his legacy was in fostering a wish to break away from received notions or practices. Even some of them may have come from Said himself. He was clearly more interested in the making of disciplines than of disciples. The intimacy between hedonism, as Said defined it, and dissent from the bedrock of his critical theory. For all the reams that have been written about Said as founding father of post-colonial studies, the term secular criticism had more appeal for him as a critical approach and a mode of thinking than post-colonial criticism. Secular criticism, Said's term, to characterize intellectual work opposed to prevailing orthodoxies and mainstream ideologies, conceived of dissent from established principles as essentially a form of resistance to religious authority. No doubt, Said used the word secular in a specialized sense to refer to worldly engagement with human rather than divine history. This use of the word has strategic value in developing his theories of textual criticism. And indeed, if I had time, I would have liked to say much more about Said's idiosyncratic adaptation of words like hedonism, molestation, and secular, uprooting them from their familiar contexts and meanings, conferring an exilic life to these terms, and rendering them homeless in the final analysis. Homelessness being a condition that he saw as essential for remaking these very terms. Expressed as multiple currents passing through him, Said's Emersonian contradictions can be approached as an enactment of the dissent he located at the heart of critical consciousness, the germ of his ideas about humanism, I think, is to be found in his reading of Orientalism's productive power in its generation of tropes, images, and metaphors that in turn illuminated the Gramscian inventory of traces left by Orientalism. Legacies are related to beginnings in an obvious way. If beginnings signal the moment of production, the inauguration of a period, an episteme or a discipline, legacies prolong that moment into the indefinite future. A field takes shape through the generative energy that propels the forward movement of ideas. Yet Said, ever mindful of the construction of disciplinary knowledge systems that induced guilt thinking, did not see himself as leaving legacies or founding schools of thought. If he had a method at all, it was one that refused methods inducing dissent and skepticism in place of affirmations. Said was enough of a contrarian to disdain discipleship because of its associations with the transmission of method and received notions. Rather, his fascination was with unexpected insights and discoveries. His abiding legacy is not so much in fields or disciplines, but in a commitment to literary scholarship as an expression of the hedonism that, in his idiomatic usage, represents the freedom of an unshackled thought. Thank you.
Our thanks to Gauri Visvanathan, who sent us those words. Thanks to Mariam for reading them. The next selection from the last interview concerns the book that Gauri's intervention relates to, Edward Said's famous book, Orientalism, which was published in 1978 and has been translated into more languages than I can count. So the next segment of the film, please.
Now I want to go back to your work and to your first books. In Orientalism, when you wrote it, what were you trying to achieve first, and second, what was the reaction that you got?
Well, my whole interest in Orientalism really began, I would have thought, around the time of the October 1973 war, when, for the first time in my history, at least of being aware, there was some Arab military success. 67 was a devastating year for me because everything I'd grown up with, although I was in America by that time, I was alone. The rest of my family was in the Middle East. But everything I had intellectually and politically grown up with, namely Abdel Nasser, perhaps because of the distance from it, had a certain prestige in my mind about it. This was Arab nationalism and so on. It all crumbled very quickly. And worse, in being in New York at the time, there was a sense of triumphalism, which appeared for the first time in not just amongst Jews, but amongst everybody, where you'd walk down the street and people would say, "How are we doing?" And it was always understood that it was Israel, the plucky little state about to be overwhelmed, but winning this tremendous victory. So there began to grow up in those years or after 67 a kind of library of cliches about Arabs, that they're cowardly, and I remember, for example, my own class of 57 at Princeton. I mentioned this in Orientalism. At the 10th reunion in 67, which occurred just after the war, there was to have been a costume in which we all were supposed to wear Arab costume. And it was changed. And you could wear Arab costume, you're supposed to go barefoot and put your hands up like that. So the Arabs had become representation of defeat and submission and incompetence and so on and so forth. And then with the onset of the 73 war, what I found interesting, and I gave a talk, I remember the first time, at the University of Michigan in the winter of 74, was exactly on this explosion of myths that suddenly, the Arabs were seen as being able to cross the canal, the Egyptians, the Syrians made it back onto the Golan Heights momentarily. And then I started to see the sort of battle for representation, which was very interesting to me, outside the Arab world. And it had very little to do with experiences, the actual lived experience, which is always my main theme, in the Arab world. And I started working on it in a kind of scholarly way, and I started tracing it back to the Middle Ages. And I found a whole library of stuff, mostly religious in the early days, but Dante, for example, where Muhammad is in the 7th or 8th circle of hell as a false prophet and so on. And I decided to write a short book about that. And I got very little interest from publishers, and I had just then gotten, in 1975, an agent. And he was able to sell it to a reputable academic press for $250, and I was made to understand that I was very lucky. Then we spent the year in California, and I was completely free. I had a wonderful year at the Institute or Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. And there I wrote this book, which grew in ways I hadn't foreseen. And then suddenly became something much more. It became the whole history of representation of the other. I think it was one of the first books to try to do that. And then by the time I finished it, when we came back to New York in the fall of 76, I met socially a prominent publisher who said he had heard about this and could he look at it, at which point I said, of course, and I gave it to him. It was nearly done, quite a large manuscript. And the next day he made an enormously large offer compared to the $250 I got, and so I sold it to him. And at first, the impact it had was, respectful, quite interestingly. I remember the great historian, teacher of a generation of historians at Cambridge, J.H. Plum, reviewed it in the New York Times. And, found it an interesting book and so on. He was slightly puzzled by it. There was that. But it took about a year, I would say, after that all the various people implicated in it, not just Arabs and Muslims, but also, Chinese and Indians especially, and then other Arabs and Africans and Latin Americans and women and, all the ones who had suffered from these representations that were part of the suppression. I mean, it wasn't just a scholarly thing, but also the way these cliches had been used to govern in the colonial state. Really made the book very much a kind of hot item. completely surprising me. I had literally had no idea whatever that there would be such an audience for it, and that it would be translated. So
what was the reaction though from the contemporary scholars that you criticized?
Well, it was interesting. It was a generational thing. The young people, like my friend Bassem Musallam, who reviewed it for Merip, which in those days was a quite avant-garde Middle East sort of dissenting academy kind of thing. Don't forget, this was the tail end of the Vietnam War and the whole question of scholarship, the role of scholarship in politics and the state was very much in the air, partly due to people like Howard Zinn and Chomsky and others. And so I felt myself to be in some way part of that, but I was really going into uncharted territory because of the subject matter. So the generational thing was quite immediately obvious, that the older people who really thought that the word Orientalism was a dignified word signifying Oriental studies and being an Orientalist, reacted with great vehemence. In some cases it took a while. I mean, Bernard Lewis, for example, took 4 years to respond to me. In the pages of the New York Review, they gave him 15,000 words to write a tremendous attack on me, which I responded to. So it was that. The older people were very hurt and upset by it. Not just the Middle Eastern ones, the scholars of India, and especially because I seemed to be touching on the fact that I was touching on it, but I wasn't insisting on it, that they were not of the people who were having the experiences, they were writing about them. And I implied in the book that the whole question of Orientalism had to do partly with who was the audience, who consumed these images, and it certainly wasn't the Orientals, but it was rather these Western scholars who wrote for themselves. Younger people, that was the most interesting thing. Even members of organizations that I had criticized in the book, like the Middle East Studies Association, MISA, within 10 years, my book had become like their manifesto. And there was a complete sort of revolutionizing of the profession amongst the young people, who then became extremely sensitive to the question of Orientalism in both positive and negative ways. I mean, the negative thing, there was a great deal, certainly in the Arab world, of simplifying, that people thought that I was really defending Islam. And therefore the Islamists used Orientalism and the book, one of the two books that came after it, covering Islam. Whereas I have nothing to say about Islam in the book at all. I mean, there isn't really anything at all about it. And then others used it as an excuse for a kind of nativism, that only Orientals should write about themselves, which I say explicitly is not what I believe in, the insider-outsider argument. And then there was a whole question, which I think was perhaps the most damaging and serious misreading, which still goes on today, which is to suggest that I identify Orientalism with imperialism, tout court, in other words, that if you study another, you're automatically being an imperialist and a racist, which is, I don't say that.
But there are instances of that.
Well, of course, yeah, I mean, but I don't say that it's necessary to be of it in order to write about it. In fact, I say quite the opposite at the end. And I end with what I think are quite, interesting open questions about how does in fact one talk about the other without making use of these hobbles that are so difficult to dislodge. The pictures we have in our head of what other people are like that we get from popular sources. In the case of Orientalism, with Islam, it of course has a long religious background. But in the book, I trace it back to the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks always had their barbarians, and that, whole question of the other was one of the things I pioneered. It became a cliche to talk about the other, or othering. It became even a verb. And Orientalism, of course.
What's the core thesis? What is it you were saying Orientalists were doing?
Well, I made a distinction between two things, really three, but one was the whole question of this division of the world into Orient and Occident. I said that it's in a certain sense ahistorical. I was accused of that. And I say you can go back to the Greeks and find it there. Herodotus talks about it. And I call it an imaginary geography because I make the point there's no line on the map that says, from here on it becomes this or that. So that seems to have had a long-standing place in culture. By the by the end of the 9th century, the Orient becomes identified with Islam during the rise of Islam. So the first 400, 500, 600 years afterwards in Europe, writing about the Orient is polemical. Yes, there are people like Marco Polo and others who write about the Orient as a place of marvels, and the whole question of strange beings, Prester John, and there's a whole literature about that. But in addition to it, and gradually overwhelming it, R.W. Southern, the great medieval historian at Oxford, wrote a whole book about it. It's part of the Christian polemic against Islam. So, they represent the Orient as a place of apostasy, of various heresies, of challenges to Christianity, very defensive, because, there they were. They crossed into Spain in 711, and they remained there until the end of the 15th century. So that was something to write about. And the third phase, which was the one I concentrated the most on, was Orientalism as it became at the end of the 18th century because of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. It becomes the formal study of the Orient, scientific. It's no longer a matter of images and fantasies and sort of wandering off into the wild blue, but actual trying to pin it down. And so Napoleon, the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt was deeply significant, in my opinion, because he was the first conqueror of Egypt. And in the preface to this Description de l'Égypte, the man who wrote the introduction, a man called Fourier, says, everybody wants to conquer Egypt. Caesar conquered it, Alexander, etc., etc. So it's natural that Napoleon, the great emperor of France, he hadn't become emperor yet, but wanted to go there. But the difference between Bonaparte and all the others is that he took with him a team of scientists, archaeologists, biologists, anthropologists, or the equivalent thereof, and those linguists, of course. And as a result of his stay in Egypt, which wasn't very long, they stayed. They produced this immense book called the Description de l'Égypte, the idea being to take Egypt out of its sort of amorphous, distant state and make it a kind of object of European scrutiny and study. And the first stages were basically linguistics. Champollion, who is associated with the Napoleonic expedition, his identification of the Rosetta Stone and ancient Egyptian, and then Paris became the center of Oriental learning. So it was mainly linguistics, so you get down the languages. And then around that comes the whole question of the mores of the people, ethnographic observation. And I call it all textual because a lot of it had to do with writing it down, whereas before it had been legend and lore and this sort of thing. It becomes more and more formalized. And it leads to not only linguistics, but comparative linguistics on the origin of languages. And it becomes a university and academic subject. And it becomes, in effect, the main reference point for later travelers. The example I give that's fantastically interesting is Gérard de Nerval, who was a great French poet who went to Syria in the 1840s. Voyage en Orient. And I was reading along in it. I remember this so clearly. Reading what I thought was a description of Syria, but it seemed like a Syria I'd never seen before. And in fact, it turned out it was Egypt he was talking about, because he had read Lane and half memorized the book, Lane's mores and customs of the modern Egyptians, and internalized that. And that became the reference point, not what he actually saw. So even the evidence of the senses was pushed aside. And so there are Oriental study societies and, the character, the mind, the mentality, etc. And it seeped into all the great novelists of the time. Proust talks about Orientalism and the advent of that. And it gradually associates itself with imperial rule, so that somebody like Cromer, who had previously served before he became, proconsul in Egypt, had served in India. The Orient really became, again, an indistinguishable place because it's all the same. They can't think, they can't tell the truth, they can't walk in a straight line, they hate walking on the pavement, this sort of thing, the Orientals. And then at the end, I talk about the United States, how after the dismantling of the classical empires, the British and the French mainly, the Americans take over. But of course there it's social sciences and it's much more abstract because there's no history of deep interaction and there isn't the adjacency, the physical adjacency, geographical adjacency between the Orient and the Occident. And then I talk about the need to liberate oneself from this. And of course here, this is where the book had a major impact. which was on, on developing countries who were in the post-colonial phase. But people like Fanon meant a lot to me at that point. And so the liberation of the mind, not just of the Islamic or Arab or Oriental mind, but also of the Western scholar, I felt, could be liberated by this sort of study. I think that's the most important part of the book.
And were you writing, and I hate to put it this way, but were you writing as an Occidental or as an Oriental?
I don't really know. I mean, certainly my training, and I was trained as a comparatist. I remember one of the most, to me, satisfying letters I got was from my old Harvard professor, Harry Levin, who is a known comparatist, probably the best known comparatist in America. When I sent him the book, he said, this really justifies or somehow fulfills the mission of the comparatist better than anything I've seen, because I talk about literature a lot in the book. It's not attacking people. I mean, this caricature of what people say I've done has stayed with the book too long. It's become a term of abuse, as Albert Hourani said. And I can't be blamed for that, because a lot of the book is, very minute analyses of texts, literary texts mostly. So I think in that respect I was writing as a Western scholar. But the driving force of the book, as exactly Hourani himself said in a review that he wrote of the book, which he found somewhat mystifying, was that you might say the animus in the book derived from the tremendous gap I felt between these accounts of the Orient that were Western accounts from the outside and my own experience. There was no correspondence between them at all. They were saying things about me and others like me that really never rendered our reality or our experience in any intelligible way. And
wasn't there underlying assumption, though, that you couldn't represent yourselves?
There was that. Of course, that was the epigraph of the book. I mean, they cannot be represented, they must be represented. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. It came from Marx, from the 18th Brumaire.
Our third speaker is Mustafa Bayoumi, who is also a former student of Edward. Mustafa is a professor of English at Brooklyn College and the City University of New York. He is a widely published writer. He's a specialist on post-colonial literature and literary theory. His books include How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Being Young and Arab in America, which was published by Penguin in 2008. It's as funny and as wry as the title sounds. Mustafa is also the co-editor of the Edward Said Reader, which was published by Vintage in 2002. Mustafa, please.
Thank you, and good evening. I really feel like I'm one of the lucky ones, because I get to talk to you here tonight about somebody who was of great importance to me and very influential, and I think was of great importance and influential to a lot of us here. But I'm really one of the lucky ones, actually, because I get to talk to you about my teacher. Edward Said was my teacher, and that was an incredibly important event in my life, incredibly important period of my life. And I knew of Edward before I ever met Edward. Like many of us, I had encountered him through words more than anything else. And Orientalism, I grew up in an Arab household in Canada, and Orientalism was by my parents' bedside. I'm sure they never read it, but it was always in the house. It was always there in the house. And I started reading, the first essay that I ever read of Edwards was Opponents, Audiences, and Constituencies. That was in this edited volume by Hal Foster called The Anti-Aesthetic, and I just was kind of really interested. I didn't quite know what modernity was, and I was trying to figure it all out. And then I thought, I want to read Orientalism. So I started reading Orientalism, and I have to say that it really gave me actually a place in the world. It actually helped me figure out how people were talking about people like me in a way that I think was tremendously important for my own development. So I decided that I really wanted to come to Columbia to study at that point. I applied and I was admitted. And I remember meeting Edward from the very beginning, and he was so important for our whole class, all the cohorts. And if you had never encountered him, it was quite something, because there was the finely tailored suits, there was the pocket watch, right? The fountain pens, and everything was just always such a performance. as well. And it was a performance, even the writing, he talks himself about writing as performance, and even the writing is a performance. And I mean that actually not in any kind of duplicitous way, in a most generous way. Edward's performance, his performativity was actually done with great generosity. And I'll give you an example. So in seminar, whenever you were in a seminar with Professor Said, everybody would have to do some kind of presentation. And as you would begin your presentation, this is what he would then do. It's frightening. It was frightening. And it was as if he'd just fallen asleep in the middle of the seminar. And then suddenly he would perk up and he would ask you a question. And it was usually, honestly, not that difficult a question. And it was it was actually an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about. And then for the rest of the class. And once you figured that out, then you understood, actually there's a lot of generosity in the performance of scholarship. There's real scholarship there too, but the performativity was an enabling thing with Edward. I remember not just the style, the watches and everything. I remember one time we had a seminar, we had a conference one weekend, and he came in a sweater, and people barely recognized him, actually, because he was wearing a sweater. And then there was another time when he'd come when I'd come to his office, and on multiple occasions I was talking to him, and there was one occasion when I was in his office where, I'm going to talk about 2 times when I was in his office and he talked to me. And the first time was when he mentioned to me how you can't write about everything. You have to write about what you know. And it was sort of interesting to me, too, because he talks about the value of being an amateur a lot, right? And not being a professional, because being an amateur means that you can be on the outside. You don't have to belong to the guild to have the kind of authority to talk about something. But I think he took his amateurness extremely seriously. Extremely seriously. It's amateurness with a certain kind of responsibility attached to it. And I think that that's a lesson that actually I myself try to take with me. And the second time was, I think it was around the time of the picture of the stone being thrown. I'm sure Jonathan Cole remembers that very well. And I was in his office, and Edward would have this tendency also sometimes just to bellow at people, right? And so I remember him bellowing at me. He's like, "What they want is my silence," And he said, "And they'll never get it." Right? And it's true. They never got his silence. They never got his silence. Only the leukemia got his silence, and now he's with kings and counselors. No doubt giving the kings and counselors a hard time. When I miss Edward, which I do often, I read Edward, which I also do often. And so I wrote a very small thing here, because recently I was reading his essay on lost causes. And so let me just conclude by reading this. In On Lost Causes, an essay composed later in his life, Edward Said writes about dealing with his own deep disillusions and bitter disappointments, particularly with regards to the state of Palestinian affairs. The essay is typical on many levels, not least of which because Edward refuses to give up on the possibilities of human resistance and creativity, even when in the throngs of deep despair. He ends On Lost Causes with an affirmation. For Edward, the intellectual is the one who has the, quote, unabated conviction in the need to begin again, with no guarantees, except, as Adorno says, the confidence that what has been cogently thought must be thought in some other place and by other people. Critical thinking, in other words, has the capacity, quote, to express the momentum of the general, Said writes, blunting the anguish and despondency of the lost cause which its enemies have tried to induce. He concludes the essay by asking if, quote, from this perspective, any lost cause can ever really be lost. This moment in Edward's extensive oeuvre rather brilliantly encapsulates why we need Edward Said. In his work, we will always find the relentless desire to vanquish the injustices of this world and to advocate for change on the basis of the creative power of ideas and ideas alone. The intellectual and not the general is Said's hero. But he recognizes that we live in a disenchanted world where heroes fail and villains, well, they continue to prevail. And yet, by the sheer force of his intellectual performance, and it was always a brilliant performance, Edward Said was able to persuade so many of us globally that it was our intellectual duty as citizens of the world to carry on the struggle for social justice, even or especially when losing. He died 10 years ago, and the world has sunk even lower in this past decade. The Palestinian people are more divided than ever, and a world away from realizing their rights and aspirations. The Arab world, seemingly on the brink of change, is swinging thunderously back towards authoritarianism. Orientalism and Islamophobia have mesmerized people the world over with their destructive divisions of the world. And imperialism, religious extremism, and economic inequality continue to ravage the globe. How can we face these realities and more with anything other than hopelessness? And yet, Said's resolve to carry on is a lesson for us all. The idea that, quote, what has been cogently thought must be thought in some other place and by other people, is a way of saying that the light of human creativity cannot be extinguished, and that by connecting our movements and our histories with others, we can discover and create a common humanity in our shared struggles. This is his lesson, and it is why I can say that we may have lost Edward Said 10 years ago, but we should never lose Edward Said. In fact, we all, myself included, miss him dearly. But regardless, we will never lose Edward. And why? Because that which he represents can never really be lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. The next selection from the last interview, the film, concerns the topic Palestine, one state or two.
Many Israelis would say, though, that what you're talking about means the end of the Jewish state, and they don't want to give up the Jewish state.
Not necessarily. If they want to have a Jewish state, which has a kind of primary importance for Jews, I have nothing against that. But they can't have a Jewish state which contains Arabs. I mean, the solution to that problem of a Jewish state is to kick out all the Arabs. That's why.
That's Benny Morris's solution.
I beg your pardon?
That's Benny Morris's solution.
Well, Benny Morris's solution, it's Sharon's solution, it's Eitam's solution. It's, a lot of people believe that that's the only way to do it. And I'm against that. I neither want to throw out every Jew who came to Palestine after 1948 or whatever the formula is, nor do I want Palestinians to be thrown out again. So I say, listen, isn't it possible, I mean, just rationally, isn't it possible that you can live in any way you choose? If you want to live as a Jew, you can do that. But you cannot ignore the presence in your midst of another people who have been there and have, rights to existence there for at least as long as you have. I mean, I've studied the history of Palestine, and actually the period of Jewish ascendancy in Palestine is very short historically. I mean, it's about 200 years between the end.
Kingdom.
Well, the Israelite kingdom, but there were many other kingdoms, and they were never the only people there. They had ascendancy during the period of the kingdoms, right? It amounts to about 200 years, but in the meantime, there were Greeks, there were Byzantines, there were Turks, there were Crusaders, and so on and so forth. So who knows? Who knows who is purely Jewish and purely Arab, etc.? It's basically a mixture. But to decide by draconian means that only Jews have the right to this land, and it's written in the Old Testament, that's fantasy. For me, the most dramatic thing that occurred in the last 5 years was the proposition in Parliament put forward by Meretz about 3 years ago that as an optional component of the Israeli baccalaureate, the high school degree, they should be encouraged or offered the opportunity to read Palestinian literature and the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. They went hysterical. They didn't want that. Why should we do that? And that struck me as a terrible augury for the future, because I mean, if you can't admit into your consciousness the existence of another people, then I mean, you're really on the road to ruin of some kind. And I felt that my role has been to precisely to make it possible through rational means for Jews to admit the existence of Palestinians and for Palestinians to admit the existence of Jews, to think in terms of equality, to think in terms of citizenship, rather than in terms of, alas, which has gone completely against my formula, to think in terms of nations and blood and language and all those potentially divisive things. It's been very, very hard.
But the reaction to the Meret's proposal to teach Darwish poems in the Israeli curriculum is evidence that what you're talking about is a utopian idea.
Yeah, it is utopian. Yeah, it is. But I mean, look at the alternative. The alternative has been bloodletting on a scale that no one can afford. I mean, the Israelis think they can afford it, but I think they're banking too heavily on unlimited United States munificence. Who knows with these people in the White House and people afterwards? They're counting on the fact that Palestinians in the end will give up. They're not going to give up. I mean, that seems to be as absolutely clear to me as. And there's not even a formula for them to give up. All that's being offered them is that they negate themselves. I mean, that's not. So I think the alternative is much, much worse than the so-called utopian, and vision, or at least the utopian proposition. But I think, on the other hand, that if one could multiply these kinds of efforts, such as mine, I think the chances of success are far greater than people suspect. But that's all that's before us. There aren't too many other offerings on the plate.
Our fourth and final speaker is Timothy Brennan, again a student of Edward Said at Columbia. Timothy Brennan is professor of English and Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. His books include Secular Devotion, Afro-Latin Music and Imperial Jazz, which was published by Verso in 2008, Wars of Position, The Cultural Politics of Left and Right, published by Columbia in 2006, Empire in Different Colors, published by Revolver in 2007, and At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism Now, Harvard University Press, 1997. Tim.
Thanks to Mariam and others who invited me. It's an honor to be here. I knew Edward for 23 years. We remained friends well after I left Columbia and got my degree and moved on. And I thought about all the anecdotes that I might have been able to tell about life in the classroom, drinking scotch. And I decided that that's not what I wanted to do. It's 10 years now since he's died, and I did in fact want to talk about legacies. I know that note was struck in Gauri's paper, and so what I really wanted to do is really talk about two ideas that I don't think have gotten the same kind of attention that others have, and so that's what I'm going to concentrate on. It's very odd actually to be here at Columbia, my old graduate student haunts. I was even married, I think, in St. Paul Chapel over here a couple hundred yards away. And it's a little depressing, in fact, to mark this particular passing of time, given that Edward has always been, over the last 10 years, an interlocutor in many imaginary conversations. And he is, after all, not here, and I can feel that too, and everything is a little gloomier as a result. When he was alive, even though I thought I had more or less internalized most of what he had to teach, there were times when I was adrift and I felt he had the ability of righting my ship from time to time. I'd like to take my note from his, what he was doing at the time. Now that is no longer possible. So I miss that probably most of all, although I also miss just his physical person, the dark, darting eyes, compassionate but also frightening, I think. They exposed an intelligence that one would never want to be on the wrong side of. But quite apart from the campus or these surroundings, it's in a broader historical sense, the wrong time now to understand fully Edward's charm, which was in the end a charm of contraries. He was charming, of course. People have already noted that. Everybody who met him knew that, felt that. But by this word, what I really mean to say is a mystique that he needed to navigate the shoals, not only of his political enemies, but at times his closest academic friends. He cleverly and necessarily escaped determinations? Can we really reconcile, for instance, the popular versions found in the many recent studies about him with his own books, from beginnings in the mid-1970s through the writing of the early 1980s, which were all to a certain degree, I would argue, conspiratorial, in a sense those studies would prefer not to see? One has to understand this about him. Every line of Orientalism, layered, subtle, and enveloping though it might be, is alive with the street-fighting energies of the 60s and 70s anti-war movements. The altogether global discovery that the United States wore an imperial death mask. And so the way to be was to be in solidarity with the foreign communist liberation struggle. What I'm saying is that the angry passions of Vietnam, Chile, the Congo, Angola, not only Palestine, breathe through the lines of Orientalism's casually bookish grandeur. The latter is annexed to the former. It is partly an argument that Palestine belongs in that anti-colonial framework and deserves to inspire the same flag burnings and capital occupations. When we think of the hours that he spent on the phone throughout his career cajoling, prompting, and persuading, when we think of those moments when he berates people like Terry Eagleton and Fred Jameson for not being political enough and for getting lost in the sterile byways of a professionalism of texts, we have to ask where this organizational sense came from. How the writer of a basically conventional study on Conrad came to lay out a strategy for survival in the great counter-reformation of Reaganism, which was, after all, the period in which Orientalism found its audience and when his fame was secured. All of this momentum, you might say, was headed in the wrong direction. How did he keep it together and continue meaning to people? It is here, precisely at that cusp, that is right after the publication of Orientalism and right before Reagan-Thatcher, that I came to know Edward. And my partial answer to my own question of a moment ago is to point out that every one of the graduate seminars Edward offered in those years, I'm speaking of 1980 to 1983, were about Marxists and communists. Today, in the profession, one gets street cred for quoting Adorno, Benjamin, and Gramsci. This was not at all the case then. I did read these figures at Madison before coming to graduate school, but it was amazing to me that there was a place at Columbia University where a professor was teaching them. He wasn't, in these seminars that I just referred to, looking at writers like Georg Lukács or Lucien Goldmann or Raymond Williams, urbanely, distantly, or with an ironic eye either, but he looked at them with enthusiasm and humility. He apprenticed himself to them. Their categories, theories, and sensibilities are everywhere in his work, which I've come to see more and more as the flowering of a 1970s apprenticeship in two things primarily, in Marxism and in philology. Although I don't think he ever completely articulated the relationship between these two. In time, he would, like King Canute, try to hold back the Reaganite and structuralist tides, creating a new constellation out of an older Vichian one, bridging the bewildered present with the legacies of an earlier left intellectual past that the MLA, every bit as much as the Reagan media, seemed to want to proscribe. He translated, I'm saying, the philosophy of class war into an identitarian underdog mission on behalf of an embattled people. He translated a philosophical obliteration of capitalism into a hatred of settler colonialism, transforming his apprenticeship with socialist intellectuals in the 60s and 70s into an acceptably scandalous ethnic contrarianism. But I think in this amazingly delicate, nimble, and as I said before, charmed maneuver that it is important to remember what his less acknowledged inspirations were, the ones to which I now refer. Let us not deny the natural affinities, ones that he saw and wrote about, at times clearly, at times in more muffled ways, between Marxism and the anti-colonial. The unity, in fact, of these two positions. This, as a sort of suave double agent, or at least a double consciousness, is the Edward I knew, with many contradictions, backtrackings at time, euphemism, but with an inner strength that continued and I think was even amplified towards the end of his life. If not always in agreement with these figures or these movements, he certainly understood these sensibilities to a degree unmatched by all but a few in the profession of letters. And I think it has everything to do, by the way, with his success, as well as his intellectual and political value for us today. So that is the first kind of thing I wanted to mention. The second now is this: a legacy that has received less play than many of the things that people have repeatedly talked and written about, including myself. His attractions to philology, his attention to secularism, to affiliation, to the spatial imagination, many of the things that he's been referring to here in this interview. And 10 years since his death have only amplified the urgency of this particular emphasis that I'm about to mention. What I mean is his confrontation with science and scientistic thinking. Think of those moments in Orientalism when he speaks with unmistakable irritation about the way that Ernest Renan, the self-styled creator of Semitic languages, annexed himself metaphorically to the work of the great naturalist Cuvier, where, as Edward puts it, Semitic was conceived as a fiction invented in the philological laboratory. For Renan, the great villain, we might say, of Orientalism, the sciences were revelatory in a religious sense. They, quote, told definitively to man the word of things, end quote, as though things had a language that only science could read. These classificatory motifs borrowed from the natural sciences in the work of Renan produced what Edward disparagingly calls a philosophical anatomy. In so many ways, Edward's writing was a proleptic challenge, not only to the system thinking of the pretentious linguistic idiom of structuralism and later post-structuralism, which is what he is really on about in the book Beginnings, for instance, but also what today has continued to effloresce in a seemingly unstoppable wave of capitulations within the humanities to the impoverished logic of what Max Horkheimer called science's traditional theory. This is, one might say, and the Marxist thought to which he was drawn as an exception here, and in fact anticipates his critique and helps to give him the language of his critique, a major story of 20th century philosophy itself, where we see the scientizing pattern within the humanities repeatedly in Saussurian linguistics, in semiotics, in logical positivism, in analytic philosophy, in the anti-humanism of Althusserian Marxism, in Deleuze's attractions to Leibniz and Spinoza, and his mimicking of the language of fractals, lines of force, modal spatialities, etc., all of the terms more or less ripped off from the exploration of virtual universes in theoretical mathematics. Today in the humanities, this trend continues with a kind of inevitable momentum. Above all, in post-humanism, political ecology, the digital humanities, distance reading, surface reading, object-oriented theory, thing theory, and so on. All of them heirs to varying degrees of 19th century positivism. It would have been impossible for him to have fully articulated all the points of contact between his extraordinary oeuvre and the post-human evacuations that now press upon us, not to mention the disturbing imperialist echoes within post-humanist theory itself. Which is to say, it is precisely a legacy, something to be built on by us who knew him and who care about his work, if we can. But facing this immense bad modernist pun, where the humanities have come to stand against humans, who do we go to, except for Edward, really, today? For this fixation today on the biotechnologically compromised uniqueness of the human body, on the non-priority of the human species, on the cybernetic triumph of thinking machines, the move in historical circles to replace the writing of history with the history of objects, this romance with death. What are these if not the desires to erase the very idea of critique, to disable the arrogance of man, and seek a no less revolutionary solution in the dissolution of the human as such? What Edward himself identified in the 2000s as a trend towards, quote, an assault on thought itself in Humanism and Democratic Criticism. It is at the meeting of these extremes that we find, at least in gestation, his greatest counter-assault, deliberately traditional in tone, even a little old-fashioned, which was one of his hidden weapons, it being an implied riposte to the pseudo-politics of the avant-garde and modernism. Let's end by recalling Edward's career-long insistence against the post-human on will, intention, choice, the activity of influence in any author always busy fitting him or herself within a tradition. It is his critique of science, or at least scientistic thinking, that historically speaking, Vico launched in its modern form in his attack on Descartes and Spinoza in the early 18th century. And this is what Edward took from Vico most centrally, although Edward doesn't foreground this part of the relationship. Perhaps it is because it is a latent insight, a governing structure, that it is left to the rest of us to develop in him and through him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. I want to thank the audience. You've been very patient. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank our sponsors. I want to give special thanks, actually, to Brink Messick and to Mariam Zohni, who did probably more than anybody to make this evening possible. We conclude our program this evening with the last segment of the film, the last interview, which is on late style. Those of you who know Edward's work will recognize that this is a reference to one of Edward's books, which was published posthumously in 2006, on late style, music and literature against the grain.
I'm going to personalize it a bit, this whole problem. And I'm thinking of a poem that Mahmoud Darwish wrote before he went back to live in Palestine. And it was, as I recall, what am I to do then? What am I to do without exile, without long nights staring into the water? What about you? Have you come to depend on exile, to prefer it?
Well, I don't know any other state. I mean, it makes no sense to me now at my age and with my declining health to think in terms of making some kind of terminal move. And I've been very interested, not for very subtle reasons, in something that I call late style. I'm writing a book, which I hope I can sometime finish, on the last period of various thinkers and writers and musicians and artists' lives. And it seems to me there are two alternatives, and the one I've chosen to study in my book is the more severe and difficult one, but to me the more interesting one. There is the idea that as you grow older, you become more reconciled, you settle your affairs, and I have this image of the sage or the older person who is settled his quarrels, rid himself or herself, as it may be, of worldly goods and settles into a kind of holy state of understanding and acceptance. Yeah, Oedipus at Colonus, for example, or the late plays of Shakespeare, Prospero at the end of The Tempest, returning to life and accepting the fullness of time and so on. There's another alternative, which is that of the late period as being one of greater intransigence, more complexity, more awareness of the irreconcilability of life, that life is not a dialectical process, as Lukács and others used to say, that if you think in terms of a synthesis, you can achieve it, even if it's only a psychological one. But rather that there's a endless discovery of new complexities and new difficulties, and I think that's what really interests me. I mean, it's not that I don't feel any more comfortable with it than I did earlier. I still feel out of sorts and at odds, and anger plays a fairly major role in my thinking about, for example, Palestine. And well, it's not just anger, but it's one is exercised. One's
You're still raging against the night.
Yeah, well, I don't know, raging. No, I try, on the contrary, I try to put it as sensibly as I can. But I don't think one loses one's ambition to try to indicate to people, that there are other alternatives. That's what I'm trying to say, that you don't just shut down at the end, that you try to open up even as you're going down, which I'm certainly doing. But you're trying to open up avenues that you can leave behind for younger people and friends and comrades and so on and so forth. I think in terms rather like that than in the others, in the sort of harmonious terms.